On Remembrance Sunday, as has happened since 1920, the monarch and other senior members of the royal family, in their capacity as honorary officers, laid wreaths at the cenotaph in London, Britain's permanent memorial to British war dead in 2 world wars and many conflicts subsequently. It is always a dignified and moving occasion, and all across Britain and the Commonwealth it is replicated at thousands of war memorials. However, very few people realize that successive monarchs have benefited financially from the deaths of some British service personnel and civilians, a story first broken by the Guardian newspaper in November 2023, but actually never hidden from the public if they chose to look. Now that is a bold statement. I'm saying that kings and queens have made money out of the deaths of some British servicemen and women and also civilians during wartime. But depressingly, it is true, and I'm going to show you how it is done. Once upon a time, all land in England and Wales belonged to the monarch, and that had been the case for hundreds of years through the medieval and into the early modern periods of history. But there was a downside to owning it all. For the monarch had to pay for the military, the civil service, etc., him or herself, and by the time of the 18th century that burden had grown too much. Although during the preceding period the governments had covered many of the costs that the monarchy incurred, the monarch still was left with a substantial bill. So, in 1760, King George III, well known to our American viewers, surrendered the income from what was called the Crown Lands to Parliament, and in return received a fixed annual payment from government called the Civil List, from which to meet his own expenses. George III's Civil List annuity was nonetheless enormous, £800,000 in 1760, or at today's rates about £152 million a year, allowing him to support both his household and the extended royal family. But there was also a side deal made in 1760, which is at the heart of this program. The king and his heir, the Prince of Wales, have private revenue streams outside of government handouts. The king retained the Duchy of Lancaster and the Prince of Wales the Duchy of Cornwall, huge feudal landholdings which generated revenue of tenants' rents, agriculture, mining, and a myriad of other activities. In 2024, this situation remains, and this arrangement has in fact been renewed on the accession of every monarch from George III in 1760 to Charles III in 2023. Interestingly, these duchies are exempt from many taxes, adding to their wealth, and through careful investments and deals provide huge private cash streams for the king and his eldest son on top of the small fortune the monarch receives via the sovereign grant, which replaced the civil list in 2011. So how much cash are we talking about? Charles III received, according to official figures in 2023 to 24, £27.4 million from the Duchy of Lancaster, and Prince William, the Prince of Wales, in the same period received £23.6 million, that is on top of the sovereign grant payment to the monarch of £86.3 million for the same period. So just from his private duchy income, King Charles is earning just over £75,000 a day. Interestingly, the Sunday Times and Channel 4's Dispatches program just launched an investigation into the financing of the duchies. They discovered, for example, that Charles is charging the National Health Service £829,000 a year to park its ambulances at a depot that he owns. A deal over 15 years that will make the king a cool £12.435 million, and at a time when the government has increased taxation across the board for British citizens in order to better fund organisations like the NHS. It was also revealed in the programme that Charles charges the Ministry of Defence millions of pounds so that British soldiers can undertake training on lands owned by the duchy, and he is the titular head of the armed forces. So turning to soldiers, what about the dead soldiers that I mentioned at the beginning of this program? One of the rights granted to the king as Duke of Lancaster is an ancient custom called Bona vacantia, Latin for empty goods. This rule says that any person who dies without leaving a will in the duchy, and if no heirs can be traced, their property and money goes to the king as the duke. This was formalized in law in 1925 after centuries of use. In the rest of the country, the property of any citizens who die intestate goes to the state, meaning the treasury, and becomes part of the government's revenue to spend on things like the NHS, schools, roads, and so on. Bona vacantia applies equally to the Duchy of Cornwall. Now, the Duchy of Lancaster, officially the ancient County Palatine of Lancaster, covers some of the most populous areas of England, for example Greater Manchester. And during both World Wars, the monarch, according to The Guardian, saw a steep rise in bona vacantia income, as some soldiers, sailors, and civilians from the duchy died intestate, and their property and money went directly to the king, King George V in World War I, and King George VI in World War II. This distasteful fact, and it is a fact which is not denied by either duchy, will come as a shock to many people, and perhaps as a big surprise to foreigners, and it continues to the present day. If you die intestate in Lancashire, parts of Merseyside, Greater Manchester, Cheshire, and Cumbria, the monarch is enriched. We don't precisely know the figures for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians who died from the duchies intestate during World War I and II, and what their assets were that were claimed via bona vacantia by those duchies. But the fact that both duchies received a rise in such payments during both World Wars must mean that it was quite a few. By way of comparison, The Guardian stated that between 2013 and 2023, the Duchy of Lancaster collected £60 million from bona vacantia revenues, and that is during normal peacetime conditions. During the 1980s, the then Queen, Elizabeth II, directed that the revenues from bona vacantia be directed into a charitable fund. But in 2020, a leaked duchy document, quote, gave officials at the estate license to use bona vacantia funds on a broad array of its profit-generating portfolios, end quote, which included holiday lets, rural cottages, agricultural buildings, and so on, that actually generate profits that go to the monarch. I'd be very interested to hear what you think about those two duchies and about what I've told you in this video. So head on down to the comments section where I'm sure it will generate a very interesting debate. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.